There is a tendency of not trusting journalism in Europe.
I think that there is a lot to be done to have these measures effectively implemented.
Because for the longest of time we also thought that governments want polarized societies.
The media's financial sustainability has also come increasingly under threat through digitalization.
So, good afternoon everyone. My name is Viktorya. I'm the co-editor-in-chief of the European Correspondent. Thank you to Free Press Forum for organizing a discussion about media freedom. I think that as a journalist and editor, media freedom and pluralism have been declining in Europe for the past years. Every year one new report comes out on free speech and free media, and the results are even more gloomy than they have been the year before, and even in the most democratic and developed countries where there's a tradition for a strong and long media sector. And in the countries where which are becoming authoritarian or semi-authoritarian, I personally feel like independent journalism is the first target of the regime. A lot of the friends in Central European countries, Eastern European countries, and the Caucasus have been affected by growing authoritarianism in the governments. So to be able to address all of these worries that we had about being a journalist and leading a media organization in Europe these days, the European Parliament and Commission undertook this challenge to create the European Media Freedom Act, which was passed on 13th March by an overwhelming majority, and it's a kind of landmark legislation that would protect journalists and media organizations. And back then, the MEP Ramona Strugari, who was leading the file in the parliament, she said that it's an act, a set of toolbox to protect journalists against people like Putin, Orban, Fico, or Janša, who take media as their, own propaganda tool. So, a bit of a longer intro, but considering the fact that it has been very widely accepted and approved by media organizations, today we are here to talk about 6 months after the elections, whether this was the right act to fight with the problems that we have about media, European media today, and how we can make sure that it is effectively implemented, basically just doesn't stay a good policy on the paper with good intentions. And to do that, we have 3 speakers. We have Eleonora Vasques, who's a journalist at Euronews. We have Juan, Ángel, and Soto, who is the CEO of Fortius Foundation / Consulting, I think both. And we have Chantal Joris, who is a senior legal officer at Article 19, based in London, and she's online. Thank you very much for joining us. So maybe I will start the first question with Eleonora. I feel like as a journalist, you have your own struggle with media freedom. So why do you think we have such a decline of media freedom in Europe and in the European neighborhood in the past decade?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the organizer to having me. And yes, I work at the Euronews now, and I produce the podcast Radio Schumann, which is a daily podcast on new institution hosted by journalist Maya de la Bom. And well, it's a big question, and as all the big questions, sometimes it's better you start replying with a beer drinking, and you have better answers sometimes, because big question, big answers. But long story short, I feel that this is connected with a declining in democracy overall. Like, how do you see democracy declining in Europe? You see, when different sectors of societies are effectively shrinking, which is not only journalism, it's also civil society, accountability of institutions, and there are shrinking of different sectors in which journalism is included. Of course, everybody knows that the fact that there is a lack of funds in any country in Europe. We are asked most of the time to be paid not that much and to arrive to the moon with a scooter, and we cannot arrive to the moon with a scooter, so sometimes we cannot deliver and we cannot find this information. And I think this is the past parallel I recently thought, also looking at your questions. But in general, I think that the crisis of democracy doesn't represent something that is happening now because there is a crisis now. I think that democracy has to be always in crisis because it has to renovate and renovate all the time because the time changes, there are developments, there are technology, there is AI, and I don't think that the democratic space is taking the same rhythm of other things, and this is a big problem. So if we have to think about democracy, we have to think about a very fast-paced development and a fast-paced evolution, which could be negative or positive, but there has to be a revolution. And at the moment, there has not been a great revolution at the same pace of other things. And this is, I think, the core problem that we are facing. And second of all, there is a tendency of not trusting journalism in Europe. Sometimes it's motivated. We have some colleagues that are very funny, of course. Other times it's less motivated because, for example, we here in Brussels, we're trying to understand what is happening, and there is a lack of transparency in many instances, and we fight to get the right information or to consolidate an information, and that's a big problem. And I would invite institutions to be a bit more confident, at least with the journalists they trust, because they can choose to talk to someone instead of another person.
Yeah, being a journalist is not easy. Everybody is hostile towards you. The institutions are hostile. The public is hostile, and your own parents are hostile because they think that you chose definitely the wrong profession. But thank you very much for your comments, Eleonora. Juan, you have a bit more of a policy background, so I wanted to ask you: it's this European Media Freedom Act actually is a set of principles, common principles for EU member states. Do you think that the way it is now, does it have the ability to actually affect the media landscape in the European Union and protect the editorial independence of our outlets, or you think that we have to go a step forward after this?
Thank you. Well, so much to unpack, I guess. Quick answer is no. Okay, this is kind of a digital bill of rights, so to speak. It's an act. When I was doing my master's at University College London, I remember one reading, which was a bit radical. The reading was by a political theorist called Susan James, I think, and she made the claim that no rights really exist unless they are effectively enforceable. Okay, well, I don't believe that. But I would argue that we have rights and freedoms that supersede whether they are effectively protected or enforced by institutions, by governments, etc. But it is true that without proper implementation, this act means very little. And it remains to be seen, for instance, whether national governments, EU member states in this case, will be able to implement some of those measures. And even if they do, superficially, I would also make the case that some more profound reforms need to take place for these challenges that we face to be overcome. Why? Because, for instance, if most EU member states don't change the funding model of most of the media landscape in our respective countries, well, you can have all of the editorial freedom you want, but at the end of the day, if the government is run by an increasingly ideological agenda, you will just get money if you publish what you should, right? And it will be a race to the top phenomenon. So only ideologically driven journalists will also get into that precarious profession, etc., etc. And this is across the board. I wouldn't say I come from a country which has been run for the past 5 years, I think, by a coalition government of socialists and communists. I don't think this is an issue of being a right-wing authoritarian or a left-wing authoritarian. I think that's across the board. I would make more of a classical libertarian argument, which would be for the government, in light of the fact that they cannot or should not fund everyone, we don't just stay out of it, okay? and let both market forces and the citizenry to have a wide enough menu option of information that really represents society and not aspires to transform it. Because and this is going back to the previous roundtable discussion, this has also a lot to do with education. So across history, it's undisputable that it's way easier to govern or control, let's say govern, homogeneous societies. At the moment, from the outlook, we live in highly diverse, pluralistic societies. But really, if we look closer, we are fairly homogeneous. If we control two things that governments are effectively controlling across Europe, one being information, which is what we need to make up our minds and vote one way or another, and education. So from the outlook, outside, we all look very different. We have different hair colors. We pray to different gods, etc. But from the inside, we are fairly homogeneous and very easily controlled. So again, I would say that there is a lot to be done to have these measures effectively implemented. And also, when it comes to the implementation of those measures, there will also be a potential undermining, actually, of free speech, because you get to decide what are the limits or the borders of free speech, and who gets to decide that, right? So even in the implementation of these measures, you can get into trouble by defining the confines of free speech, because provided that not everything goes, right? And I think most governments would agree that that's the case. Then what does and what doesn't? And if so, if there is someone that, and I will shut up here, and if there is someone that gets to define what goes and what doesn't, will that be different across member states, provided that there are also different in terms of the homogeneity or the, religiously or ideologically, in terms of the differences that we also find across Europe? So will there be, in terms of menu option, again, of information, which might be more diverse, I guess, in France or Spain than in Hungary or in other places? Anyway, just a few thoughts.
Yeah. I would actually like to question you after, of course, asking Chantal a question, but the position that you raised about governments wanting homogeneous societies, because for the longest of time we also thought that governments want polarized societies. So how these two kind of views, which are both I think correct, coexist in the media landscape right now. But that, after we talk to Chantal, you have worked a lot on the articles that are linked to the media providers' relationship with digital platforms and social media. So I wanted to ask you, based on your experience and what you have heard from the media organizations, what are the major conflicting points at the moment between global or European digital platforms and media providers?
Yes, hi everyone, thank you for having me. I can see only the panelists, so I cannot see the other participants in the room, and I'm glad to be able to join online, although in person is always much better, of course. So how do we see the problem maybe at Article 19 when it comes to, again, this relationship, this very complex relationship between news providers and online platforms? I think it's clear that media's financial sustainability, and which feeds also into so many of the other issues that you have discussed, right? And it's really not to be separated, also this offline from the online space. The media's financial sustainability has also come increasingly under threat through digitalization. So many users consume media not directly from the media's website, for example, but from social media. Studies also show that the big tech companies basically and the online platforms dominate the digital ad market. And at the same time, of course, specifically social media companies have an enormous power through their recommender systems, through the content curation, how they rank content, to decide what sort of media service provider might get amplified, what users, what sort of media and news is effectively consumed by users online. And linked to that, there is also the concern about the content moderation done by the platforms, where they check whether content is in line with their own rules, their own terms of service, or potentially also with the laws regulating content in the given countries. So there's a lot of these elements that are all have their own issues and that sort of are interrelated, but yet also to be looked at a bit separately. And many governments, also outside the EU, around the world, have sought to find regulatory solutions to this problem of the media dependence, increased media dependence on the largest online platforms. And we've seen proposed solutions that went from obligation on large online platforms to share revenues, implementing licensing or copyright models, tax-based solutions. From a freedom of expression perspective, each of these solutions sort of creates challenges and opportunities at the same time. So this is generally something where I don't think like the golden solution has been found yet, really. And really maybe there hasn't been enough focus on the monetary incentives of each of the players involved, including, for example, advertisers. And focusing, going back to maybe the European Union and the EMFA specifically, I want to say as well, Article 19 thinks as a whole, the EMFA is an important step in the right direction. When it comes to these three provisions, I believe, that deal with this question of media dependence on online platforms, we think that it is a bit of a missed opportunity. And why is that? We think that there is it focuses overly on basically content moderation. So I don't know if everyone in the room is familiar with it. It basically gives a sort of privileged content moderation procedure for self-declared media service providers. So basically, they can request from very large online platforms special treatment, in the sense that a platform has to communicate to the media service provider before suspending certain content. And if there is an issue, it will process any complaint with priority and without undue delay. And if there are recurring issues, then there is sort of a way to enter into a dialogue between the platforms and service providers and the media service providers. And what is our issue with it? The problem that we have, which is why also we oppose sort of content moderation exemptions in the Digital Services Act, which didn't end up making it into the text, is that we don't want specific freedom of expression rules effectively, or content moderation rules, depending on which actor posts the content, right? So we have maybe citizen journalists, or we have any user really that might be posting something that is equally of value as an more established news media service provider. And so we don't think that different rules should apply to different actors, and the protection should come from what is said rather than who says it. And also, we believe it is, again, a bit of a missed opportunity, because it doesn't really fix necessarily the dependence of media service providers of the platforms. And we would have liked to see more tailored ways to address this structural dependence, for example, based on decentralizing recommender systems, more based on sort of competition law solutions. One thing that we have proposed is that platforms should open up the recommender systems, so that media actors are not dependent on just the one recommender systems that is sort of controlled by the platform, but it can also sort of rely on different recommender systems. Users will have more choice about the information they consume. So we think that there the EMFA, it missed a bit this opportunity to look at it from more of a structural economic perspective, which we think is at the core of this issue, and much less controversial from a freedom of expression perspective.
And just to follow up on your question, do you think that there has been enough consultation with media organizations and like stakeholders, or do you think that, as always, the institutions kind of overtook the process without necessary consultations?
I mean, look, at the same time, I do want to acknowledge this was a complicated chapter. So we had digital rights organizations on the one hand, which were very much against this sort of special privilege for media actors. On the other hand, we had journalists and media providers who were in favor of such a mechanism. So I also don't want to pretend that making everyone happy in this space within the best intentions is an easy task. I mean, there were consultations. I don't think a lot of the criticism about this provision specifically has been taken into account. I still think it tries, even on the content moderation aspect, I'm not sure exactly what it tries to do. The self-declaration mechanism has been criticized. I'm not sure if it's about the lack of consultation or just sort of maybe the lack of political will to look really at the economic incentives or just, you know, maybe with good intentions, they went for a solution that we think is misguided, basically.
Okay, thank you very much. And I want to go back to Eleonora, because a big part of also where we are with media is the structure of our media sector, because there are these massive organizations which have the big chunk of the Brussels and European media market, and they are very small organizations that are trying to survive on small grounds or project or crowdfunded, and they eventually kind of die out because the finances are not sustainable. Do you think the way the European media market is now, do you think it's actually sustainable? Is it enough? There's there enough competition between big and small outlets, and is it in general easy to set up a foundation or media organization these days?
Thanks. Well, in Belgium, no. I mean, anyone knows that creating a new thing in Belgium, it's almost a nightmare from what I heard also from your boss actually recently. It's, I mean, in terms of taxes, in terms of whatever you have to do, but even having a VAT in Belgium, it's like, it's a real nightmare. So it depends a lot of on national, oh my god, I feel a bit of the commission. It depends. It's up to member states. It is what it is. I mean, it depends on the national context in terms of fiscality, but also last year I had the opportunity with some Erasmus funds to do a sort of traineeship in Taiwan as a young entrepreneurs to know like how is the private sector in Taiwan and so on. And what I noted that is for sure in places like Asia or the US, there is more, it's a matter of the political culture on the private sector. It is easier, or maybe the reality forces you to try more and more in investing in a startup, in a new media, in a new company. And here in Europe, I think there is less in comparison with the US or China or in general, for example, in Asia, the tendency to open a new company, a small company. And I remember when I was in Taiwan, there were massive funds from the government to help on this. And for sure, it is in general for any kind of company, not only journalism. For sure, we have, for the role of social media, as Chantal said, is crucial. I mean, we have our contents that from small media to the bigger media are shared on social media, and most of the time people don't even check whether the information are true or false. And this, I think, would change even the word of plurality in our society. In a sense, because of course there is, I mean, I work now for a big media, not big as others that of course they are more leading. I'm thinking here in Brussels, the FT, or in the World, the New York Times. There are big media for sure that they lead the information, and if we also, as journalists, we want to understand whether our information are right or false, sometimes we check with our colleagues on this media or on the website. And for sure, I think, like, for reasons connected to the lack of culture of entrepreneurs here in Europe is the first difficulty for journalism, and in general, people, I think, tend to try to go to the bigger as instead of as you did with the European Correspondent to try to find a space in the market, which I think there is, because in Brussels, I think the environment of journalists interested in Europe is growing, even though Brussels is closing and closing toward journalists. And I think there are some missing opportunity there, and I think there is not an optimistic evolution of the media environment in such a dimension.
Thank you very much, and I have to say that yes, indeed, based on our experience, there's definitely always like a niche in the market because people are thirsty for stories. I would say now it's not like the era of news is gone. People want stories because this is what matters. It's meaningful and it's not exhausting the way news became exhausting in the past year, especially with all the politics.
Can I add one thing? Yes, of course. Yeah, when you quoted polarization, another thing that makes the media very homogeneous are different kind of polarizations. I mean, migration, yes or no, Brexit, yes or not. Of course, you that are in the room know very well that reality is too much simplified sometimes in the media, and polarization is the death of journalism, I believe. Because, I mean, how can you explain like Brexit or migration or the Media Freedom Act in a yes or no? I mean, and we have to follow that flow, like in the title, for the CEO, we have to follow this tendency, like pushbacks, no pushbacks. I mean, it's not that, it's more complex, and when you have to explain things, people are, less interesting or is less sensationalistic, and then there are less clicks, and then there are less visitors, and I mean, we are a bit slave of it, and for me, sometimes it's very frustrating. Just that.
Yeah, and being a journalist always has this downside of have to be commercial and SEO optimized, but that's another story. Juan, I want to talk about another thing, about the soft power, normative power of the European Union, a very boring topic that academics wrote a lot about. But very often we have seen that the EU passes a certain act, and this act is kind of is outsourced to candidate countries or neighborhood countries in a way to make sure that they either align a lot of their legislation with the European Union, especially the candidate countries in the Balkans and Eastern Europe, but also kind of create the coherence and influence in the neighborhood. So now the situation of media in the European neighborhood is terrible, to be honest. I mean, in Georgia they just passed the Foreign Agent Act, which is heavily impacting all the media organizations that have been established, which receive Western funding quite often for a fair reason, because who's going to give funding to an organization that criticizes the government? In Azerbaijan, we have had a lot of our journalists quitting working because they are scared for their lives, and now most being jailed as well without any notice. In the Balkans as well, being a critical journalist is not easy these days. So, will this act, does this act have a way to help? Don't say no, give it a bit of time. But yes, to influence and protect media pluralism in the European neighborhood. And if not this act, what then?
Short answer, no. I mean, again, as I said earlier, I think it's very limited when it comes to the capacity to be implemented in EU member states, well, much more so in EU neighbor states, so to speak, neighboring countries. And from a twofold perspective, I guess, because this act can be also seen, and we've touched both aspects, but it can be approached from two different perspectives. the business side of things that you just described, okay, the media landscape, but also but that would be the supply side, okay, of information. But then there is the demand side of information, which has more to do with free speech, with freedom of information, with the kind of the consumers, right, of information, your audiences, in short. And that leads us to human rights talk, to democratic quality talks, etc. And I think this won't help because of lack of kind of coercive power. And in that regard, I would say that the EU sometimes uses soft power, sometimes hard power, especially when it can withdraw massive funding. Okay, has been the case with rule of law issues, especially with Hungary or Poland in the past, etc. So I'm sorry to be that pessimistic, but it's just how I say things. Now the good thing, despite the limitations of this regulation, contrary to well, actually myself in the past, maybe a decade ago. So I used to be one of those that criticize pretty much everything that the EU does in terms of regulation, just because of, you know, the kind of the regulatory drive of the EU institutions. And I would have hold at the time a more libertarian approach to things. So just, you know, stay off. Let's deregulate. Let's not regulate this or that. Increasingly so, and especially when it comes to technology related issues or these types of things that we are discussing today, I think that the EU might have kind of a strength, a competitive advantage, because of regulating first. Now, obviously, it needs to regulate not only first, but well, right? So it needs to be kind of a good regulation or smart regulation, as some people say. And that can lead the way. So from that perspective, the fact that the EU is the first to strike when it comes to regulation doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, despite of the limitations. Why? Because whenever other countries regulate, they already have, even if they massively disagree with EU standards in general, but there is a precedent, so to speak. There is some type of a guideline that they can copy, imitate, or so. And in that regard, it's good. But I'm pessimistic as to the impact this can have beyond EU borders.
Well, that's very sad for a lot of my colleagues back in the regions that I just mentioned. Chantal, passing back to you, I want to ask you about this intermediary role, because the Media Freedom Act actually positions itself as an intermediary. That's what the Act itself kind of says. It's basically almost a code between media providers and digital and digital platforms. I want to ask you about how successful do you think this structural dialogue can be organized between the two? And we also see that the Act establishes a European Board for Media Services, which will probably be the highest authority under the Act. Will this body be responsible for this structural dialogue, or it will be more like on the Commission as well?
Thank you. I also want to maybe briefly follow up on something that has been said. We have seen, again, in particular in sort of the digital space, a lot of regulation coming out of the EU. Thinking, for example, of the Digital Services Act, which will also, I think, have quite a significant impact to be seen whether good or bad on freedom of expression online, including on journalists and media service providers. And there, I think it's not only something we try to emphasize again and again. It's not only about the letter of the law or the legislation in of itself, but it's also what they're going to do in enforcing and applying the regulation. And we do see, again, in this space of saying regulating online platforms, for example, as well a lot of interest around the globe for sure in what the EU is doing. Sometimes they pick and choose a bit from the regulation, but also sometimes if regulation is applied and enforced, for example, in a politicized manner, it can unfortunately give an excuse to more authoritarian-leaning governments as well to say, wonderful, let me do the same. And again, in particular, I understand earlier you had a lot of discussions around disinformation as well. In particular, these like very complicated concepts where there might be legitimate concern about disinformation, but then at the same time, obviously, such an obvious risk of instrumentalizing and abusing these concepts just to censor and stifle dissent, basically. So, and very briefly about this structured dialogue that you mentioned. So basically, the EMFA tasks the European Board for Media Services with sort of regularly organizing this structured dialogue between very large online platforms, media service providers, and also representatives of civil society. In essence, again, to discuss sort of content moderation challenges, including how this privilege mechanism that I just described worked, to, I quote, foster access to diverse offers of independent media on VLOPs and monitor adherence to sort of self-regulatory initiative around harmful content and disinformation. Generally speaking, we welcome the recognition that civil society should be part of such regulatory efforts. I mean, on the one hand, they should remain a watchdog completely outside the regulatory system, but in certain instances, we do also believe that they should have a seat at the table. Other than that, there is very, very little detail. Also, to your question, will the board be in charge, will the commission be in charge? I don't know if there have been any further discussions, but just based on the text, there is very little detail about how this will actually work. And we do think actually the devil is going to be in the detail about whether this could be a promising initiative. For example, when it comes to CSO participation, there needs to be financial support for them to be able to meaningfully participate. It's very important that sort of small and local media be represented, again, not just the big players who tend to have access more than any other player anyway. Make sure that all the different stakeholders are also, their input is equally taken into account, and that we don't see just sort of a discussion that effectively happens between the most powerful parties and sort of gets legitimized by the presence of, again, smaller actors or civil society in the room. And one thing also we thought, again, that it would be better to be able to open up the discussion not just to content moderation, but to all challenges when it comes to media dependence on online platforms or whatever those challenges might be, which they might look different in 5 years than they do now. Also, we're a bit concerned about the fact that there is like a report that goes to the Commission, which may or may not be public. So we do think transparency will be key. On the one hand, on procedural aspects, who gets to have a seat at the table, were the different inputs, what were the different discussions, so that there is no risk of, again, misrepresentation of the discussions, together with sort of having it legitimized by the fact that they can say, but civil society, for example, was present. So I think, yeah, it remains really to be seen how this is gonna play out. It could be a promising mechanism, but yeah, it could also be quite a useless initiative. It really remains to be seen.
Yes.
If I may add to this point of this intermediation dialogue between publishers and media platforms, I think the Act might fail to have a clear view on whether media platforms are not also publishers, meaning when it comes to content moderation, when it comes to all that has to do a lot with ideological bias, of which media platforms are full of, okay, one way or another. So through content moderation, you can get a media platform which is not just a wild west of information, but very much driven to this or that ideological standpoint that amplify certain messages and certain publishers and minimize others. So I think that remains to be decided upon whether we treat media platforms as yet another publisher or not.
I think there's a rule that, especially considering the fact that it addresses very big platforms, there's a 45 million people rule, I think, and I'm not sure a lot of outlets would pass that threshold. That might save them, actually. But indeed, actually, it's a very important question, and indeed, some media organizations are social networks by themselves. There are two other aspects of the Media Freedom Act that impact personally journalists, and one is the cyber surveillance. The second aspect is the protection against strategic lawsuits against public participation. And we're going to talk about both and then we'll open the floor for questions. So when it comes to the anti-SLAPP measures, actually the act itself has a reference to that, but also in April this year another directive was passed, which is the EU anti-SLAPP directive called Daphne's Law in memory of murdered Maltese journalist, exactly. And these two kind of are supposed to complement each other. One is a directive, another one is an act. I want to understand, based on, of course, your observation, do you feel like this is enough to protect journalists against persecution and kind of legal action? Or do you still think that journalists are feeling vulnerable and not protected?
Well, first of all, I think both the SLAPP and anti-SLAPP and the Media Freedom Act can, of course, mitigate some problems that we are experiencing as journalists in different EU member states. I mean, if a journalist is a victim of, surveillance or that the government is putting pressure through judiciary measures, for sure, having this legislation in force, it can help more in comparison of not having them. So for sure there will be a mitigating effect on this. It doesn't mean that solve the whole problem. And I'm thinking in particular in my country, I'm Italian, and the practice of bringing journalists in trials, it's very, very common. It's not just Giorgia Meloni's government, it was also with the other governments. So it is a political culture that we have, and I think it's tremendous, and it's putting, and most of the time is made against opinions or against investigations towards very powerful people that we have in Italy. And this is, of course, a very Italian problem, I would say first. So for sure, like, if I think about my colleagues, and some of them I know that have been sued recently by the government, for sure it can help. And this is, for example, a good start. Let's put it that way. For the spyware, unfortunately, I don't see, again, the Italian case, many consequences for cases in which my colleagues were spied. I know, in particular, for example, in the field of migration, which unfortunately I see it's a bit of example of how the direction of the Commission is going towards member states when it comes to migration, and there has not been hard consequences on politicians that were spies on my colleagues in Italy. And for sure, what the Commission has is the very, very famous bad word that we use here in Brussels of infringement procedure. So if there is an infringement of the EU law in a member state, that the Commission has to start infringement procedure, and if after a certain period the countries continue to do nothing, then there is the Court of Justice. So it's a long process, and that we have it at least.
We live long enough for that.
Exactly. So for sure, it's better having it than not having it. But at the same time, changing the on the Media Freedom Act. I think it could have done better because member state puts more less safeguard on journalism, in particular on journalist spy. That is something that I was very surprised when during the negotiations, and or maybe not very surprised. But I mean, we are in a moment in which, you know, the division line. This is something also I had at university in London when I was studying there. The division line between public security and freedom of speech, it's hard to find, you know. And now the tendency is public security, going towards public security, which is not helping. Of course, there is not a golden solution, because there will be always a problem of finding the right division. But at the moment, we are tending much more towards public security, and this is a problem for us.
Especially, I think if you make that decision choice once, it's very easy to normalize it for the second and third time.
Yeah, and about infringement procedure, I think in the last year there has been no infringement procedure on migration, for example, because the political environment is pushing toward a direction in which member state has to have the power to do whatever they want, even though we have endless documented journalist investigation, institution reports, Council of Europe of systematic pushbacks and violation of the international law on migration. But there has been no infringement procedure because there is a political pressure on it. And I'm scared that this will be the tendency with other sector of the, you know, Commission DGs.
Well, it's the sad truth that journalists are often treated as spies just because of the work that they do, and also because people take criticism very personally as well. But
some of us are also spies, I heard, but
are we?
There are.
I have no idea about it. But I don't have a poker face enough to be a spy. Actually, everything is very much written on my face. But the way you deal with spies also use spyware against them, and sadly the European Media Freedom Act allows a use of spyware on case-by-case basis, which was a major discussion point in 2023 when the act was being discussed in the parliament as well, and some people and organizations rang the alarm bells about it. Don't you think that this might be actually abused by a lot of the EU member states, the fact that there's this case-by-case is allowed unless there's actually a need for that? I know the answer is going to be yes, but I want more elaboration.
Everything gets abused eventually. Well, obviously, the first thing, as you just said, we lean towards security and not liberty, but there are high stakes when it comes to national interests in many cases. So, for instance, in the case of Spain, the country I come from, we find Russian influences in separatist movements in Catalonia, for instance. So it'd be nice for the Spanish government to know who's being, paid by the Kremlin, I guess, right? But then once you have that mechanism, that tool, then what you just need to do is to kind of open up a bit the definition of what goes against the national interest and put every enemy of the state, or in this case the government, in that category and espying. That said, I think political pressure takes many shapes and forms, and quite frankly, I don't think, at least within the EU, that politicians or governments, really, more than politicians, that they need to spy on our journalists to make their life miserable. I think the journalists are vulnerable to economic pressures, to funding, to defamation campaigns, to be sued, right, and brought to the court. But again, for instance, suing people, it's not a bad thing per se, especially in a media environment where where journalists, with some noble exceptions, they don't want to publish the truth, but to publish first. Okay, so there and if it's sensational, the more it is, the better. Which in this case makes the possibility of suing whoever is going against the truth a very useful tool. Actually, I would make the case that would incentivize journalists to get their story straight, okay, and their facts right. But then again, as a mechanism, it gets abused, right, by very often organizations or institutions or political parties, all of which are massive in comparison to a tiny media outlet or a single journalist who at the end of the day is unprotected. So
The consequences about if actually we found out that the member state is spying on, which was the case with Pegasus, right? What should be the consequences that would be fair to the journalist, considering everything that the...
But again, we live in a highly globalized and globalist world where we, people have many, allegiances, I guess, ideological ones. But at the end of the day, we have to be aware that we are still citizens of nation states, right? So there is such a thing as a national interest. So unless we, directly, heads on confront that reality and say, listen, I was born in Spain, but I'm in this, ideological tribe where I'm a citizen of the world, or I'm a European or whatever. Well, there will be security issues that need to be, put in check, I guess, by the corresponding authority. So I don't have a perfect solution. I think these mechanisms are, well, not only that they need to be in place, but that they will always be in place, provided governments have that technology. And if that's the case, I'd rather have it be on paper and overseen more or less and checked by other EU member states and by the EU institutions. Because let's not fool ourselves. In this world that we live in, where we are very much transparent to the public eye, for the public eye to see, we are being, we can call it spied if we are using a spyware. We are known, okay? Our information is out there, and the public authorities, they have the mechanisms to search for whatever information they're looking for and to monitor that information. So I'd rather have it be regulated. Again, if it is a reality, let us regulate it, and let us regulate it in a way that is more aligned with personal freedom and hopefully privacy also.
I know the temperature in the room is still warm. I want to check if there are people who do have questions to the panelists.
I actually do have one.
You do have one?
Yes, I do have
okay,
one.
Okay, maybe then...
Yeah, I take the mic here. Following what you... Sorry, I just need Chantal. I move away, otherwise when it comes to Pegasus, you just mentioned it, the question is, there was an hearing, there was a committee, a subcommittee actually in the parliament, and nothing happened on that. Basically, they just said, we can continue to use spyware in case of national security. So, my question that actually goes to all of the panelists, but especially to the two of you that are journalists, is why do you believe that member states, government, treat journalists as terrorists? Because spyware can be used in case of national security, as Juan just said. So why there is this connotation that journalist means danger for national security? And it's for all of you, but mainly for the two of you as you are journalists. So what's trigger? Because until 10 years ago, this was not the case. Yes, in authoritarian states was the case, but not in Europe, after Europe was very much pro-freedom and allowing media to thrive and grow.
I'll let Eleonora first answer.
Well, if you think carefully about what we do in our job, like sometimes there is the idea that journalism is writing up, but actually for us the main job is talking to people and getting, confidential information, which is basically what a spy would do as well. It's getting, like, if you do intelligence work, you get information, you try to get information as a main topic, as a main thing in your daily life. You do something very similar to a spy. And there are some journalists, I was not joking before, I mean, there are some journalists that start to work for some governments and cover it.
Potentially returned to Kremlin.
Exactly. I mean,
Potentially.
there has been cases. So, what the governments have the worry about that some of us can be spies. I mean, it's something that it could happen. It's not that we are just living in this space that we want press freedom and everything. Like, I mean, there is a reality, and also I think it's also dictated by the fact that as journalists we are not usually, in comparison with other profession, paid well. So sometimes there is the temptation to say, I can have more money, and sometimes it's just, I don't know, like there are people taking such decisions. But besides that, I don't think there is this high percentage of journalists that decide to do that. Also because if I were the government, I would really choose carefully who could be, a covered spy in the journalist landscape. Also because, spoiler alert, I mean, in Italy, in my country, everybody knows who is a spy. More or less, who is. So among us, we know more or less. So it's not that we call it in Italian segreto di Pulcinella. It's the secret that everybody knows. But besides that again, it's not that a secret. I don't think that this heavily pressure on every journalist in that way is so much justified, because it's not that much spread. Usually who is a spy, and most of the time, I think, as he said, is abused and is politically motivated. I mean, that's a clear problem that we have. As I said before, there is a tendency to cover as public security political pressure, because there are so many, and this commission is not exempted by the political pressure. To me, the last mandate and this mandate of von der Leyen will be a commission heavily political, with a lot of favors, with a lot of tendency to abide to member states, in particular to some that are key. So I don't see that this tendency is totally justified.
Very quickly, because I've been, in the past 4 years in Brussels, I've been working in politics as well and in media, and some people think it's very incompatible and don't understand how do I separate the both, but I managed to separate both. But I see every time the room changes, when I'm with political people or with policy people or institutional people, when I tell that I'm actually also a journalist and an editor, the mood immediately changes in the room. And the same happening is when with a journalist I'm telling that I work in politics and policy. So there is a very clear division, but I would say the problem is that governments don't like being held accountable for whatever they do. Journalism was supposed to be a profession not for many. Now, many people have access to journalism and write on different platforms and social media. You can have 12,000 followers on Twitter, on X, and you can become an influencer, be actually nominated and prized and awarded as an influencer, and then because of the journalist that holds government or leader accountable. So journalists are often the nuisance on the way of democratic and not so democratic like leaders and governments and politicians on the way to power. And it doesn't have to be always power in a most negative term of absolute power, but just power. Even democratic governments claim power, and they want to have power, and they want to maintain that power. And the way that meta narrative can actually change the way they have this power, of course, is a big problem. So it's no wonder that they are often villainized and they are often, bashed way more for the things that they do. And what a journalist wants is actually to sit down and write about things that they see and try to be honest about it, try to put all possible bias aside, because every person has a bias. If a therapist treats a patient, the therapist also has bias, but they have to put together that when they are working with the client, right? The same with journalists. So I think just this intense accountability and the fact that the cycle never stops of news, of surveillance, every little thing that you do is scrutinized. But it's the same for us as well. Every little thing a journalist does is also scrutinized. So I think we're not as different as people think we are. And with that, I would probably want to close off the discussion because we're out of time. It was very interesting. Thank you very much. Chantal, I'm really sorry. I had that question about like the connection between DSA and the Media Freedom Act, but I feel like people are not in the mood for the legal explainer, even though I personally am. So maybe I can contact you after. But thank you very much for joining.
Thank you very much, everyone.
And yeah, wish you a lovely evening.